and started to break up into multiple fragments. These fragments spread out along the course of its orbit to form a torus of lethal debris that crosses the orbit of the Earth. For decades, the stones of Egypt have done more than mark time, they have refused to be explained away. They stare back at us with flat faces and exact edges, and in those surfaces lies a quiet accusation. How did people long before our modern machines manage work so precise on rock so unforgiving? Graham Hancock says he has an answer, and he says the proof sits in the stone itself. His claim is simple but radical. The methods taught in classrooms and repeated in textbooks, he argues, are only part of the story. The tools we are told we use, soft copper and gritty sand, cannot by themselves account for the mirror smoothness, the seamless joints, the spiral drill cores, and the uncanny tolerances found in places like Saqqara and the interior chambers of the pyramids. Hancock proposes that somewhere in the deep past, there existed practical knowledge and technology so effective that it left behind results that seemed to the modern eye almost impossible. He refuses to accept that patient hammering and endless labor explain everything. He asks us to look more closely at the evidence and to imagine an alternative history where knowledge was passed down deliberately or accidentally, then gradually forgotten until only traces remained in the stone. It helps to begin with the place that first fixed Hancock on the trail, the subterranean tunnel at Saqqara that opens into the Capium. Surface archaeology gives us one story for that site. A 19th-century dig uncovered a long corridor cut into limestone chambers lined with massive boxes made from single blocks of Aswan granite, many weighing tens of tons. Official accounts tie those boxes to a late-period ritual use, burials of Apis bulls in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. That narrative is neat. It has dates and names and a tidy function. But when engineers started to measure those boxes closely, neat began to look inadequate. The internal faces, according to those who examined them, are flat within 1/1000th of an inch. Corners are square and edges razor sharp. When light falls across those inner walls, they reflect like glass. Such finish is the sort of work modern industry prizes, and for which it uses bench lathes, precision grinders, and polishing compounds. It is not the sort of finish copper tools produce when aided only by sand. Take Petrie's core number 7. The object itself is small, but to the engineers, it reads like a page torn from a manual which does not belong to the era it was found in. A cylindrical core of granite with a spiral groove wound around it in even, perfectly spaced turns. The spiral does not vary. It is continuous and exact. Chris Dunn, an engineer who has spent a lifetime looking at mechanical precision where none should be, examined that core and found in it the suggestion of a conical drill bit spinning at steady speed while being forced downwards. The thread of the groove implies a ratio that reads like modern machining rather than manual labor. When Dunn made a latex impression and flattened it out, the spiral became unmistakably regular. How was this done with a hand crank and a copper bit? Recreating the same feature with known ancient techniques has not been achieved. Tests with copper cores and abrasive sand come out rough, ragged, full of pits and tool chatter. The core from antiquity carries none of those signs. Pumapunku in Bolivia and other distant sites present similar puzzles. Where Hancock sees echoes of a single technique passed across continents, critics see coincidence, isolated ingenuity, or even modern misinterpretation. The debate reduces most often to a single question: do the stones tell about forgotten machines and advanced skills, or do they testify to human patience, repetitive labor, and clever improvisation? Hancock invites us to accept a third possibility. What if ancient builders followed rituals that embodied technology, methods transmitted without understanding the physical principles which made them work? The method would appear as tradition, as sacred practice, and over centuries the why behind the how would vanish. All that would remain would be recipes and outcomes, the polished boxes, the flawless joints, the spiral cores. That is the gap Hancock points to and the place where he brings his evidence. The Serapeum is useful as an illustration because it presses on multiple mysteries at once. The granite came from far away. Moving blocks of that weight without wheels or modern cranes creates logistical problems. Cutting out cavities precisely deep in the underground chambers where sunlight could not help was another. Lighting the space while protecting workers and keeping dust under control complicates things even more. Yet the boxes were placed and sealed. The lids are heavy slabs that fit like lids on vases. How did workers set such lids into place in narrow tunnels where there was no room to operate conventional mechanical advantage? Answers proposed by mainstream archaeologists often involve ramps, sledges, clever ropes, and a lot of human muscle. Those solutions are not impossible, but they are brute force. They do not address the questions about precision. Brute force gets things roughly right. It rarely achieves mirror finishes or tolerances that make joints disappear. Hancock and the engineers who work with him insist that the marks left behind are the primary archive: the surface texture, the small regular pits, the tiny ridges within a drilled hole, the patterns that repeat in distant sites. These are the fingerprints of tools and processes, where copper and sand produce ragged abrasion and variable depth. The granite at the Serapeum and inside the Great Pyramid frequently shows evidence of machine-like consistency. The grooves that spiral on Petri's core, for instance, suggest a steady rotational motion and a consistent feed rate. That is not an attribute you expect when you rely on human muscles as the primary power source. In a hand-driven drill, rhythm varies, speeds change, pressure is uneven. A machine, even a simple mechanical rig, can maintain steady speed and constant feed. Critics ask for proof that what Hancock calls evidence actually requires an unknown technology. They challenge him to demonstrate that modern attempts at reconstruction cannot produce the same results with known materials. In some instances, such replications have been attempted, and in most, the outcome aligns with the critic's expectation. Copper cores with abrasive grit can produce cut marks, but they take extraordinary time and leave telltale textures. That is the central tension at the heart of the controversy. Either the ancients were endlessly patient and exceptionally clever to a degree that strains credulity, or there was a technique that allowed them to move through granite with machine-like regularity. Beyond the physical marks, Hancock looks at context. If a technique allows for the kind of precision seen in Egyptian stonework, then why is the visual vocabulary so consistent across widely separated sites? Why do we see similar circular drill marks in the hands of builders who lived at different times and in different regions? Hancock is interested in patterns which repeat where no obvious line of communication exists according to conventional histories. He points to shaped blocks at Pumapunku and certain cut stones in southern India as cousins to Egyptian examples. To him, this is not evidence of a lone genius appearing in different places, it is the residue of a shared knowledge. To skeptics, it is convergent evolution. Different societies could have arrived at similar solutions to similar material problems. That remains plausible. Yet, the uncanny degree of similarity, especially when the work itself is outside what we might call the expected capacities of the tools available at the time, keeps the mystery alive. The Great Pyramid sits at the center of this argument because it combines scale with precision in an extraordinary way. Hancock begins with the facts that are easy to measure. The base of the pyramid is level to a remarkable degree. The casing blocks and the interior galleries were laid with a care and geometry that still confound surveyors. The internal chambers include granite beams and blocks placed with tolerances that modern engineers admire. The counterargument remains that this was painstaking work achieved by highly organized labor over decades. Hancock responds not by denying organization or effort but by pointing out that organization cannot explain the specific nature of some feats. How do you cut, fit, and polish granite to near perfect flatness inside a sealed chamber? How do you make a joint so tight that the seam is all but invisible? How do you cut a spiral core like Petrie and then throw away the evidence that proves the operation was mechanized? Some of Hancock's collaborators tried to bridge the gap by suggesting that ancient craftsmen used top-notch abrasives combined with lathes powered by human or animal teams. A weighted drilling rig turned by capstan could in theory keep constant speed for a limited time. If the drill head was tipped with crushed EMI or even microscopic diamond grit, the cut could be far finer than crude copper saws. Others invoke the unlikely but not impossible use of harder metal alloys than we currently credit the ancients with. Bronze mixed with other materials or tools tipped with imported stones could do better. But these ideas often run into the hard constraint of archaeological absence. We do not find the massive waste of copper required. Nor do we find accumulations of abrasive materials at the scales we would expect if craftsmen had labored for centuries cutting stone with such techniques. Hancock takes a different path. He asks us to consider a memory of technology, not its full presence. Maybe there was a period when knowledge of an efficient method for cutting and drilling stone existed widely. That knowledge might have been transferred through teaching and ritual rather than through blueprints. Over centuries, the explanation behind the practice might have been forgotten until all that remained were procedures and the finished work. Later, builders copying the ritualized process could produce results without understanding the mechanics. That would explain why the stonework is consistent and yet no workshop remains with the expected detritus of industrial production. Ritual can preserve technique while masking principle. This theory also offers an answer to the perplexing fact of apparent decline. In many places, the best stonework seems to belong to older strata and later work appears crudder. If knowledge had been lost in waves, with high skill surviving in isolated guilds, then we should see brilliant anomalies embedded in standard histories. Hancock reads the anomalies as traces of a lost transmission rather than as flukes. If you accept that conclusion, the Great Pyramid and the Capium are not isolated marvels but the relics of a wider tradition. What about dating? Critics point out that the dates anchor the pyramid to Khufu and the Serapim to late-period pharaohs. Hancock challenges that foundation by asking whether everyone dated the correct age to the actual stonework. Radiocarbon dating of organic material around a structure gives dates for the moment those particular organics were last alive, but not for the quarrying and shaping of the stone itself. Pottery found in association can tell a story about reuse and deposition, but it might describe a later disturbance. In the Serapim, for instance, pottery might indicate human activity in a tunnel at a given time, while the boxes themselves predate that use. That possibility makes the notion of an older origin plausible. It does not prove Hancock's thesis, but it opens the door to questions historians need to answer with care rather than assume at the outset. If an advanced technique did exist, then we also have to answer another question: where did it come from? Hancock's preferred candidate is a lost civilization from before the end of the last ice age. He is not alone in suggesting that human societies could have been more sophisticated in certain ways than we usually assume. Geological evidence shows the end of the last ice age was a time of disruption, rising seas, and shifting coastlines. Could a culture with advanced material knowledge have been submerged or broken apart by climate change? It is a romantic and troubling idea. It is also difficult to prove. Yet proponents point to the distribution of strange, precise work across continents and the suddenness with which certain building skills appear to vanish from the record. If you imagine a network of craftsmen dispersed across a now-drowned landmass or trading across coastal routes stranded by rising seas, the transmission of a technique does not seem so impossible. Skeptics retort that we have no direct evidence of such a civilization. They want to see artifacts, workshop remains, and tools. They point out that the archaeological record, though imperfect, is resilient. Where intensive production took place, some trace usually remains. The lack of such evidence is the strongest argument against Hancock. He responds with the mantra, absence is not evidence of absence. Sites can be erased by catastrophe, organic materials rot, metals corrode, the sea hides, and salts remove physical proof.